Lonely rich rancher takes in a widow and her child, unaware she will become his family forever. The snow whipped through the Montana hills like a ghost with claws, tearing at what little was left of the trail. Abigail Weaver pulled her shawl tighter across her shoulders, though the threadbare wool had long since lost its warmth. Her boots, cracked and soaked through, crunched in the deepening snow as she guided her son forward. "Just a little more, Caleb," she whispered, her voice raw from the cold. The boy, only 6, didn't respond. His face was red from windburn, his hands stiff in mittens too small. He leaned into his mother's side, shivering violently. Abigail's lips cracked as she whispered again, "We'll find shelter, I promise." Through the swirling white, a faint glow flickered in the distance. A light, a house. She didn't know whose, didn't care. It was a lifeline in a world that had turned its back on her. The storm screamed louder as she reached the porch, Caleb clinging to her skirt like a second skin, her hand, numb and shaking, lifted to knock. Once, twice. A pause, then harder. She tried to call out, but her throat cracked, letting out only a hoarse rasp. Inside, Elijah Boone sat in his chair by the fire, a leather-bound book open in his lap. The wind rattled the windows, but he paid it little mind. 10 years of winters had passed like this, quiet, cold, survivable. Until now. The knock came again, louder. He frowned, stood, and reached for the rifle propped by the door. Few people traveled this road, and none unannounced. He cracked the door open. What he saw stopped him cold. A woman, pale and shaking, her clothes soaked and torn. Beside her, a boy, small, blue-lipped, eyes wide with fear and frost. "Please," the woman rasped. "We don't need much, just a place to wait out the storm." Elijah narrowed his eyes. "Who are you?" "Abigail Weaver," she said, almost stumbling. "This is my son, Caleb. We've been walking since this morning. Our wagon—" It broke down outside the pass. Elijah looked at them both. Something about the boy, his silence, his shiver, pressed hard against something Elijah had buried years ago. "I don't take in strangers," he said gruffly. Abigail dropped to her knees, her arms wrapping protectively around her son. "I'm not asking for charity. I just don't want my boy to die in the snow." Her voice broke, the desperation in it sharp enough to cleave through even Elijah's frozen heart. Caleb looked up at him then, eyes huge and glassy, his lips trembling. Something cracked. Elijah stepped back and opened the door wider. "Inside before you both freeze." Abigail didn't hesitate. She half-lifted Caleb and stumbled through the threshold. Elijah closed the door behind them with a solid thud, shutting out the storm. "Sit by the fire," he said, already moving to pull blankets from the nearby chest. "Don't touch anything." He tossed a heavy quilt over Caleb's shoulders, then handed a second to Abigail. She nodded, clutching the warmth to her chest. Elijah moved into the kitchen and poured hot water into 2 chipped mugs. No tea, just heat. He brought them back without a word. Abigail murmured, "Thank you." Elijah said nothing. He stood by the mantel, arms crossed, watching the steam rise from her cup. "This ain't permanent," he muttered. "Storm breaks, you move on." "I understand." He looked away, but his eyes flicked back to Caleb, now curled in a ball, breathing softly beneath the quilt. "Kid's lucky you knocked when you did." Abigail's voice was quiet. "No, sir. I'm the lucky one." For the first time in years, Elijah Boone wasn't alone in his cabin, and though his words were cold, something in his gaze had warmed, if only by a flicker. And so began a night where silence said more than kindness, and a storm that brought with it not just snow, but a new beginning. The wind outside howled into the blackness, battering against the walls of the cabin like fists desperate for entry. Inside, the fire crackled softly, a flickering heartbeat in a home that had forgotten warmth. Elijah Boone stood in the kitchen, his calloused hands gripping the handle of a dented kettle. The silence behind him was different now, quieter, not from emptiness but presence. He poured hot water into a small pot, dropped in sliced carrots, potatoes, and a handful of dried herbs. "No meat tonight," not with guests. Guests. The word didn't sit right. This was not an inn. This was his home, his solitary sanctuary carved out of grief and silence. Yet here she was, Abigail Weaver, sitting cross-legged by the fire. Caleb curled into her side beneath layers of borrowed blankets. She had peeled off her wet stockings, her feet bare and pink from the cold, resting on the edge of the hearth. Her eyes, half-lidded with exhaustion, watched the flames like they held her last thread of strength. Elijah cleared his throat. "Supper," he said simply, ladling thin stew into tin bowls. He placed them on the table without ceremony. "Ain't much, but it'll keep you warm." Abigail stood slowly, her body stiff. "It's more than I expected," she said, taking the bowl gently. "Thank you." Caleb sat on a stool, knees pulled up to his chest. He accepted the bread Elijah handed him like it was gold. Elijah sat last, opposite the woman and child. He ate in silence, eyes on the fire more than on them. After a while, Abigail spoke, her voice low, almost a whisper. "We came from Wyoming. My husband, Caleb's father, left before the first snow, said he was going for work, never came back." Elijah did not look at her. He only nodded once. He didn't ask for more. She continued anyway. "I stayed. Thought maybe he'd return. When the food ran out, I still stayed. Then Caleb got sick. That's when I knew, if I didn't move, we'd die there." Elijah looked at the boy, who now slurped soup with two hands like it might vanish if he paused. "He's strong," he said, almost to himself. "What's that?" Abigail asked. Elijah shook his head. "Nothing." When they finished eating, Abigail rinsed the bowls and set them neatly on a towel to dry. Caleb had curled back into the quilt, half asleep. "I'll take the floor," she offered. Elijah didn't argue. He brought over an extra quilt and set it down near the hearth. Then he turned away and muttered, "I'll check the furnace." The old iron stove in the back room had been moody for years. It worked well enough, but not evenly. Tonight, Elijah cleaned the grate, adjusted the vent, and added more coal than usual. He lingered there longer than needed. When he returned to the front room, Abigail was already lying down. Her chest rose and fell slowly, hair fanned out across the makeshift pillow. Caleb was nestled close, tiny fingers clutching a corner of her skirt even in sleep. Elijah stood over them for a long moment, shadows dancing across his weathered face. Then Caleb stirred, eyes fluttering open. The boy looked up at him, blinking slowly. "I never slept anywhere this warm before," Caleb whispered. Elijah's throat tightened. He knelt without a word, reaching for the folded quilt beside the rock. He draped it over the boy carefully, tucking it in at the sides. His hand brushed Caleb's cheek. The boy didn't flinch. Elijah sat back on his heels, his gaze locked on the boy's small face. And then, like a ghost too familiar to name, another face came to him. Softer, rounder. A girl's. His daughter's, gone 10 winters now. His chest tightened, and he stood abruptly, blinking fast. He stepped away, retreating into the kitchen under the pretense of wiping down the table. From the doorway he glanced back once. Abigail slept, without stirring. Caleb snored lightly. The fire crackled on, and Elijah Boone, who had long since stopped believing his home could feel anything but hollow, stood in the warmest room in Montana and felt his walls begin to shift. The storm did not ease. By the third day, the snow had piled high along the fence posts, nearly swallowing the barn's lower rails. The road out was gone, lost under drifts and silence. Elijah Boone rose before dawn, as he always did. The wind had calmed some, leaving a strange hush over the land. He dressed in his thickest coat, laced his boots, and lit the lantern. When he opened the front door, the cold slapped him like a warning, but he stepped into it anyway, boots crunching over fresh snow, breath steaming in the air. Behind him, a soft voice called out, "I can help." Elijah turned. Caleb stood in the doorway, his two big coats slipping off one shoulder, his little hands balled into fists. "You sure?" Elijah asked, not unkindly. Caleb nodded with the solemnity only 6-year-olds carry. "Mama says I'm stronger than I look." Elijah gave a short grunt that might have been a laugh. "Come on then." They crossed the yard to the barn, Caleb slipping and scrambling but never complaining. Inside, the horses stirred, their breath rising in clouds. Elijah handed Caleb a small bucket. "Feed bin's over there. Scoop oats, not too full. Watch your fingers." Caleb followed the instructions with earnest clumsiness. He giggled when one of the mares nuzzled his coat pocket. "She likes me." Elijah wiped his hands on a rag. "Most creatures can tell when someone means no harm." Later they hauled hay together. Elijah showed the boy how to hold the pitchfork, how to walk where the floorboards wouldn't break beneath his boots. When Caleb stumbled, Elijah caught his elbow, steadying him with a hand larger than the boy's whole arm. "You'll get there," Elijah said quietly. That afternoon, back at the cabin, Abigail swept near the stairs while the stew simmered. She paused to adjust a crooked frame on the wall. A photograph, faded but still clear. A woman smiling beside a little girl with curls and big eyes. The same eyes Elijah had. Abigail stared at the photo for a long time before turning away. In the corner of the cabin, Caleb sat near the fire, humming softly to himself, still red-faced from the barn. "You did good out there," Elijah said as he approached. Caleb looked up, grinning. Elijah sat beside him. In his hands was a small object wrapped in cloth. He unwrapped it slowly. A wooden horse, no bigger than Caleb's palm, carved with care. The body rough in places, but the mane delicate, the eyes soft and deep. "I made this for you," Elijah said, his voice low. Caleb gasped and reached out carefully. "Is it for real?" Elijah nodded. "Your first horse. Sort of. Keep it. So you remember the one you fed oats to this morning." Caleb clutched the toy tight to his chest. "Thank you, Mr. Bone." Elijah cleared his throat, glanced away. Abigail watched from the kitchen, her hands still on the counter, her eyes misted. That night, as snow crept again against the windows, Abigail tucked Caleb into his cot near the hearth. He held the wooden horse against his chest, already asleep, a small smile on his lips. Elijah sat alone by the window, a book in his lap, unread. Abigail approached quietly. "You didn't have to do that," she said, nodding toward the fire. Elijah didn't look up. "Didn't do it for thanks." She hesitated, then stepped closer. Still, it meant the world to him. Silence stretched between them, filled with the pop of burning logs. Abigail folded her arms. "You're a good man, Elijah, even if you don't want to be seen that way." He closed the book slowly. "I'm not good," he said quietly. "I'm just not cruel." Abigail didn't argue. She only looked at him for a long moment, then smiled faintly. "Maybe that's more than enough." Elijah turned back to the window, but his fingers lingered over the place where he'd set down his carving knife. Outside, the wind began to rise again, but inside the fire burned steady, and for the first time in years Elijah Boone felt the quiet hum of something beginning to thaw. Night had settled deep over the plains. The storm outside had thinned, but cold still pressed against the windows like an old memory refusing to be forgotten. Inside the cabin, the fire flickered low, casting golden shadows on wooden walls lined with dust and silence. Abigail sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug, long emptied. Across from her, Elijah Boone leaned back in his chair, boots crossed at the ankles, a quiet stillness in his posture. "I don't talk much," he said, breaking the silence. "Guess that's no secret." Abigail managed a faint smile. Silence can be peaceful. He studied her face, then looked away. "Sometimes it's just loud in a different way." She took a slow breath. "My husband's name was Silas, Silas Crow." Elijah didn't speak, just let her talk. "He was charming when we met. Handsome, told me I'd never have to lift a finger again." She laughed bitterly. "Turned out the only thing he lifted was his hand, against me, against our boy." Elijah's knuckles whitened around the armrest, but he stayed quiet. "When things got bad, I thought he'd change. For Caleb." But the only thing he changed was how easy it became to walk away. She looked down at the table. He left us outside Cheyenne with a sack of flour and a lie about coming back. Elijah's voice came low. That's not a man. It's a coward. She nodded slowly, eyes misted but dry. I don't tell you this for pity. I know. She looked up. Why did you open your door? Elijah stared into the fire for a long moment before speaking. I lost my wife and daughter 10 winters ago. Fever took them both in a week. I buried them behind the barn. Then I buried the man I was. Abigail reached across the table, her hand stopping just shy of his. I'm sorry. He gave a short nod, then stood as if to shake the weight off. From the back room came a sharp crash, ceramic shattering against wood, then silence, then a small voice. Mama? Abigail shot to her feet. Elijah was already halfway down the hall. They found Caleb near a low shelf, eyes wide, face pale. At his feet were the broken pieces of a pale blue porcelain vase. I didn't mean to, I just wanted to see it better, Caleb stammered, trembling. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. Abigail knelt, pulling him into her arms. It's okay, baby, it's just a vase. Elijah knelt slowly beside them. He picked up a large shard, turning it in his hands. That belonged to my wife, he said. Caleb's face crumpled. I'll go. I can leave. No. Elijah's voice was firm but soft. You don't run from a mistake, you fix it. He placed the shard on the table nearby, then looked Caleb in the eyes. You ever use glue? Caleb blinked. A little. At school. Good. We'll fix this one together. Might not be the same, but sometimes the things we mend end up stronger. Caleb nodded quickly, relief washing over him. Later they sat together at the table, Elijah holding pieces steady while Caleb applied glue with careful fingers. Abigail stood back, watching the two, her heart rising to her throat. Elijah didn't rush. He didn't scold. He guided. Let the boy try. Let him fail, then try again. Hurt things don't stop being worth keeping, Elijah said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. When the final piece was placed, Elijah sat back. The vase was misshapen now, a web of golden cracks crossing its surface. But it stood. Like new, Caleb whispered. Elijah smiled faintly. Like real. That night, as the fire dimmed, Abigail lingered by the doorway, her voice low. Most men would have thrown it away. Elijah looked at the vase, then at her. I lost too much already. Don't plan on losing anything else if I can help it. She stepped closer, voice trembling. You didn't just help Caleb tonight. You helped me remember what safety feels like. Elijah didn't answer. He just nodded once, slow and solemn. But when she turned away, he reached out, just for a second, and gently placed his hand over hers. And for the first time since her world had shattered, Abigail Weaver let herself believe it could be built back again. By the time the last of the snow melted into the hard-packed earth, rumors had already begun to stir in Cedar Ridge. It was the kind of place where the wind carried whispers better than it carried dust, and the sight of a woman and a boy living up at the Boone Ranch had drawn curious glances and low voices. No one remembered the last time Elijah Boone took in company, much less a widow and her son. Elijah heard it first at the feed store. Stranger woman out at Boone's place, someone muttered near the sacks of grain. Claims she's a widow, but folks say her man's not dead, just gone. He didn't respond, just nodded at the clerk, took his supplies and left, his expression unreadable. Days later, the past caught up, not in person, but on paper. A letter slipped under the door, no return address, just one sentence scrawled in a harsh, angular hand. You've got what's mine, signed Silas Crow. When Abigail saw the name, her face went pale. He found us, she said. Her voice shook, but there was steel beneath it. She explained carefully. Silas was not just her ex-husband. He was the father of Caleb and the heir to nothing but trouble. Years ago, Caleb's grandfather had left the boy a patch of land, nothing large, but valuable enough to catch a greedy man's eye. Silas hadn't cared before, but now it was leverage. "He'll say it's about Caleb," Abigail said, holding the letter in her trembling hands, "but it's always been about control." Elijah didn't speak for a long time. He only said, "He won't get him. Not while you're under my roof." That Saturday, Elijah posted a sign outside the general store, "Meeting at Boone Ranch, noon." The townsfolk came. They came because Elijah Boone didn't call on people often, and when he did, it mattered. He stood on the porch that day, back straight, eyes calm. Abigail stayed inside, keeping Caleb close. She didn't ask what he'd say. She didn't need to. The barnyard was full of familiar faces, ranchers, the blacksmith, Ms. Clara, the teacher, even the preacher. They stood in the cold wind, waiting. Elijah stepped forward, his voice low and steady. "I took in a woman and her boy this winter, not because I had to, because it was right. Now the man who left them behind wants the boy back, not for love, but for what he stands to gain." He looked around the crowd, his gaze never wavering. "He's coming here with threats, maybe the law, I don't know. What I do know is this: he won't take them. They're part of this place now. They're part of my home." No one spoke at first, but then, slowly, heads began to nod. Inside, Elijah crouched beside Caleb and pulled something from a small box, a weathered child's cowboy hat. He brushed it off and set it gently on the boy's head. "This was mine when I was your age," he said softly. "It reminded me to stand tall." Caleb smiled. "It's yours." "Not anymore," Elijah said. "Now it's for someone brave enough to wear it." That afternoon, the sound of hooves broke the quiet. 3 riders. At the front, a man in a dark coat with a smirk that never reached his eyes. "Afternoon," he said as he dismounted. "Nice crowd, but I'm just here for what's mine." Abigail stepped out, hand tightly clasping Caleb's. "You lost that right when you left us to freeze." Silas looked toward Elijah. "This your idea of justice?" "No," Elijah replied. "This is family." One by one, the townsfolk stepped forward, the teacher, the preacher, the ranchers. "We stand with them." Silas looked around, saw he was outnumbered, and spat on the ground. "This ain't over." "No," Elijah said, steady as ever. "It's just beginning." Silas rode off, but the people stayed. And Abigail, heart full, looked at Elijah and whispered, "Thank you." He tipped his hat to her and turned to Caleb, fixing the boy's new old hat. "You did good, son." Caleb beamed, and in that moment something settled in the soil, quiet and sure. They were no longer guests. They were home. Silas Crow returned on a Monday, this time not alone. He brought a lawyer, sharp suit, sharper tongue, and a stack of papers thick enough to crush hope. "Custody," Silas said as he handed the documents to Elijah on the porch. "Legal, binding. Caleb is mine by blood and by law." Abigail stood in the doorway, her face pale. Caleb clutched her skirts, not fully understanding but sensing danger. Elijah didn't flinch. "You may have blood, but that's all you ever gave him." "We'll see what the court says," Silas replied coolly. Then he mounted his horse and rode off, the lawyer not far behind. Elijah wasted no time. He rode into town that same afternoon, stopping at the office of Thomas Braddock, the only lawyer in Cedar Ridge who'd ever stood up to city men with slick coats and colder heart. "We've got 4 days, Braddock said, looking over the papers. "It's not hopeless, but it'll take everything we have. Witnesses, records, proof of care." "We have it," Elijah said simply. "Start with me." Back at the ranch, Elijah did not speak of the trial much, but Abigail noticed the changes. He cleared out the room at the end of the hallway, the one that had remained closed since the day his daughter died. Dust danced in the air as he opened the curtains for the first time in a decade. He scrubbed the floor, repaired the cracked windowsill, painted over faded pink wallpaper with warm, earthy browns. And when no one was looking, he hung something on the wall, a small drawing Caleb had made the week before. A horse, awkward but proud, drawn with crayon. That evening, Abigail found the room open. She stepped inside, heart pounding, and saw the bed made, a shelf of storybooks, and Caleb's drawing hanging straight above the pillow. Her eyes filled. She turned to find Elijah in the doorway. "You fixed it," she whispered. Elijah shrugged. "He'll need his own space, eventually." Abigail crossed the room in 3 steps and hugged him tightly. He didn't move at first. Then his arms came around her, steady and sure. At court, the benches were full. People who'd never attended a hearing before came in support. Mrs. Greaves, who ran the bakery, Pastor Roy, who'd baptized half the town, even old Judge Bailey, long retired, sat in the back silently. Silas's lawyer was slick, polished and ruthless. "Mrs. Weaver is a widow with no means, no property, and a history of transience. My client is the child's biological father and legal guardian. Custody must be returned." Braddock rose calmly. "Your Honor, we have testimonies and sworn affidavits from over a dozen townsfolk stating Abigail Weaver has provided stability, safety, and education to her son since arriving. We also have medical records indicating past injuries consistent with abuse during time spent with Mr. Crow." The judge, a stern man with steel-gray eyes, listened in silence. Then, one by one, the townspeople stepped up. "She taught Caleb to read," said Mrs. Greaves. "She helps at church every Sunday," Pastor Roy added. "She came here broken," said Mr. Abernathy, the blacksmith, "but she built something." Then Elijah took the stand. He stood tall in his worn coat, eyes steady. "I don't have much to say," he began, "but I know this. Family isn't who you share blood with. It's who you show up for. 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 It's who you show up for." He glanced toward Abigail and Caleb. "I lost a daughter once. I thought I'd never open that part of myself again. But then these two came into my life, not because I asked, but because they needed a place to stand. And somewhere along the way, that place became home." The courtroom was silent. Even the judge leaned forward slightly. Elijah continued, voice rough but sure. "You can talk about paperwork, but I've seen real things. I've watched this boy laugh again. I've seen Abigail sleep without fear for the first time in years." "You don't fake that," he paused. "And I'll stand with them, no matter what comes next." The judge called for a recess. Outside, Abigail gripped Elijah's hand tightly. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. "You already did," he murmured, glancing down at Caleb's drawing, tucked in his coat pocket. An hour later, the verdict came. "The court finds it in the best interest of the child, Caleb Weaver, to remain in the custody of his mother, Abigail Weaver. The petition for sole custody filed by Mr. Silas Crow is hereby denied." A wave of emotion rippled through the courtroom. Abigail cried openly. Elijah stood quietly, only allowing a small nod of satisfaction. As they walked out of the courthouse, a hush followed them. But in that hush, there was no judgment, only reverence, because today Cedar Ridge had not just seen justice. They had seen love, earned the hard way. And for Elijah Boone, who had once thought himself beyond redemption, something deep inside began to thaw, for good. The Montana sun rose slowly over the frost-kissed plains, casting golden streaks through the cabin's windows. Inside, the warmth of the hearth was matched by the gentle clatter of breakfast. Abigail stood at the stove, her hands dusted with flour as she kneaded dough. Caleb sat near the window, humming softly, sketching a horse with a stub of charcoal on worn parchment. Outside, the distant clucking of hens and the rhythmic stomp of hooves gave the morning its steady beat. Elijah leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, watching. The light fell across his weathered face, but something softer lived in his eyes now, something that hadn't been there a season ago. Once, silence had filled his home like smoke. But now there was laughter, soft humming, the shuffle of a child's feet across the floorboards. Life had returned. "You know," he said, his voice low, steady, "I think it's time you helped run the ranch." Abigail turned, surprised. "Run it? What do you mean?" He crossed the room and laid a thick ledger on the table between them. Its pages were yellowed, corners dog-eared, years of numbers scrawled in Elijah's rough script. The accounts, the planning, you've got a head for it. I've seen how you stretch every bit of flour and firewood. This place isn't just mine anymore, it's yours too. Abigail looked down at the ledger, then up at him. Her eyes shimmered. You trust me with this? I trust you with more than that, he said simply. Just then, the door creaked open, and Caleb burst in from the yard, a wide grin on his face and a too-big cowboy hat sliding over his ears. Pa, look, I can ride Shadow all by myself now. Elijah froze for a breath. Pa! The word landed like a stone in still water, unexpected but perfect. Slowly he crouched down, adjusted the hat on Caleb's head, and smiled. You're a real cowboy now. From the kitchen, Abigail pressed a hand to her heart. Caleb had never called another man that. He'd clung to her alone through every cold mile and dark night. But now, here in this warm place, something had changed. A bond had formed, real and deep. Later that day, Elijah showed Abigail around the ranch, pointing out fencing that needed fixing, the pasture rotation, and where the spring crops would go. That plot by the river, that's where I want the tomatoes this year. Soil's good there, you'll see. She nodded, scribbling notes in the small ledger he'd handed her earlier. We should move the haystack closer to the barn before the next frost. It'll save time, Elijah grunted in agreement. Told you, you've got a good eye. The rhythm between them had shifted. There was no longer hesitation in Elijah's words. No guarded pauses. Abigail's presence no longer felt like an intrusion, but a necessity. That evening, after a dinner of roasted vegetables and warm bread, the house settled into its new stillness. The kind not born from loneliness, but contentment. Abigail sat beside the fire, brushing out her hair. Elijah sat nearby, sharpening a small blade. The glow of the flames flickered across the wood-paneled walls, casting shadows that no longer felt heavy. I'm happy here, she said quietly. They should be, Elijah replied. She turned toward him, her voice softer now. And you, are you? He paused, the whetstone stilling in his hand. For a long time I thought peace meant quiet. No voices, no memories, just nothing. But now, hearing Caleb laugh, seeing you fill this house with warmth, I realize quiet isn't peace, it's emptiness. Abigail's eyes welled up. I never meant to stay forever. I never meant to want you to, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. She reached out, her fingers brushing his. But do you? He closed his hand around hers, firm and sure. I want everything you bring through that door. Every smile, every sound. Even the chaos, especially the chaos. Abigail laughed, tears slipping down her cheeks. Then this is home, he nodded once. It is now. From the next room, the sound of Caleb's quiet breathing drifted through the doorway. Outside, the stars blinked into life over the prairie sky. And inside, beside the fire, in a house that had once been defined by loss, something new was blooming, steady, strong, and warm. Family. The sun dipped low over the Montana plains, bathing the rolling fields in gold. Laughter echoed across Elijah Boone's ranch as neighbors from town gathered for the first celebration the old property had seen in years. Long tables were draped with checkered cloths, laden with pies, roasted meats, and warm bread. Children chased one another near the corral, and a fiddler played upbeat tunes near the porch. Abigail stood near the steps, her dress swaying in the breeze, cheeks flushed with joy and disbelief. Caleb, in his small boots and freshly brushed hair, darted between guests, leading a game of stick-horse races. You gotta stay in the lines, he shouted gleefully. Pa says real cowboys ride straight. From the edge of the barn, Elijah watched them both, one hand resting on the post beside him. His usual stoic expression had softened. He'd spent most of his life building fences to keep people out. Now he was watching the fence gates wide open and the world walking in. Didn't think I'd see the day, muttered Old Man Radley, nudging Elijah's shoulder. You hosting a party? Next thing you'll be painting the barn red. Elijah gave a rare chuckle. Never say never. A sudden whoop of laughter drew their attention. Caleb stood on a hay bale, his arms raised high. "I have the best ma and the best pa," he shouted. "I don't need nothing else." A hush fell over the crowd, warm, reverent. Abigail turned toward Elijah, her eyes shimmering. Elijah stepped forward, his boots crunching over gravel. He approached Caleb first, lifting the boy down and ruffling his hair. "That's a mighty big heart you got, son," he murmured. Then he turned to Abigail. The music slowed, conversations faded into whispers. Elijah took a deep breath, reached into his coat pocket, and pulled out a small wooden box. Inside was a simple silver ring, sturdy and elegant, but the centerpiece was unmistakable, a tiny carving of a wooden horse, echoing the one he had once whittled for Caleb on a snowy afternoon. Abigail gasped. "I gave Caleb a gift once," Elijah said, voice low but clear, "so he could remember the first horse he ever cared for. Now, I'd like to give you this, so you'll never forget who stood by you when the storm hit." He knelt, slow and deliberate, in the grass. "This ranch was a place of ghosts," he continued, "until you and Caleb walked through that door. You brought back laughter, hope, family. Abigail Weaver, would you let me keep building this home with you, as your husband?" A choked sob escaped Abigail's throat. She nodded through tears, kneeling beside him. "Yes, Elijah, 1,000 times yes." Cheers broke out. Hats were tossed into the air. Old Mrs. Webb dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, and Pastor Collins let out a delighted whoop that startled the horses. Elijah stood, lifting Abigail to her feet. Caleb rushed into their arms, wrapping them both in a fierce hug. "We're really a family now," he cried. That night, under a sky speckled with stars, the celebration carried on. Fireflies danced in the tall grass. Musicians played long into the evening. Neighbors shared stories, offered blessings, and sang songs by the fire. Abigail stood with Elijah and Caleb beneath the great oak near the corral, where the wind whispered through the branches. She slipped her hand into Elijah's, and he tightened his grip gently. Caleb leaned against his mother's side, eyes heavy with sleep. "Do you think it'll always feel this good?" she whispered. Elijah looked down at her, then at the boy who now called him Pa. "If we keep choosing each other," he said, "then yes, it will." And in that moment, with the lanterns glowing behind them, the land stretching wide and open before them, and the warmth of shared hearts holding them close, they knew this wasn't the end of their story. It was the beginning of a forever. If this story moved your heart, if it reminded you that family is not always born but chosen, built through kindness, courage, and the quiet promise of staying, then we invite you to stay with us. At Soul-Stirring Stories, we share tales just like this one, stories of healing, of hope, and of home. So, if you believe in second chances, in quiet heroes, and in love that grows in unexpected places, subscribe now and never miss a story that just might change your day or your life. And remember, sometimes the warmest homes are built not from bricks, but from hearts brave enough to begin again.